how do you approach writing a story that continues something as iconic as Bram Stoker's Dracula? And can you talk a little bit about that process?
That was a tough one for me. Obviously, when somebody asks you to write a prequel to Dracula and it's Bram Stoker's family that's asking you to do it, the answer is always yes. You find a way to make it happen.
Greetings, and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast. We talk with published authors and writers to learn more about them, their books, and the writing process to become better writers ourselves. Today, I am joined by JD Barker. Welcome to the podcast, JD.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Indeed, indeed. So for those listening in who may not know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm one of those guys. I was an overnight success, 20-some years in the making. If I go going way back, I've been writing pretty much my entire life. Started when I was a little kid. We didn't have a TV in the house, so we used to hit the library all the time. I had a sister who was 15 months younger than me, so I would write stories, I would staple them, and I created like this little library in my room, and she'd check them out. I'd charge her late fees. So that's kind of where it started. My parents encouraged writing, but they always added this little caveat. It's a fantastic hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. And they kind of drilled that into my head. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I finished up school. I went off to college. I got a couple of degrees, ended up working in the corporate world in finance. But I would come home at night and I would write to stay sane. And I was doing a lot of like side projects. I had basically stumbled into a career as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, basically helping other people tweak their manuscripts and get them ready for publication. So I kind of fell into a rhythm of doing that for it was 23 years. And over that time frame, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times bestseller list that I had essentially written, that all came out with other people's names on the cover. And that just gets old after a while. So number 6 hit up and my wife pulled me aside and said, let's come up with a way to, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's figure out how to make it happen. But at that point, we were kind of stuck because, when you kind of follow that life map that everybody tells you to, we had a big house, but we also had a mortgage. We had cars and we had car payments. We had a boat. We had boat payments. Our monthly nut was somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000. It was supported by the salary I had. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. So I was making decent money, to pay for all this stuff, but I couldn't just walk away. There was just no way to do it. So my wife came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side and, basically got to the point where we could sustain ourselves on the savings account. I remember the day we sat down at the kitchen table and we looked at the bank statement. She said, "You've got about 18 months to make it as an author. Go." Nothing like putting your feet to the coals to make something happen.
No doubt. Wow. So yeah, you've definitely had quite the journey, and speaking from a lot of experience. So one of the first questions I had, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners of this podcast would be curious about, is what would you say are like the top things that you've learned that has made you to be such a successful writer?
Well, I think a lot of it, I published my first book at 43, but I'd been writing my entire life. I probably could have started publishing novels in my 20s, gotten a trad deal and done that whole thing, but I don't think I would have done as well as I am today, simply because I worked so long behind the scenes. I kind of learned what the folks in New York were looking for. Working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, a lot of the people that hired me were agents, they were editors. If let's say an editor buys a manuscript from a debut author and they love the book, but there's one particular problem with it. Maybe it's too long, or the dialogue is, they've got trouble writing dialogue, whatever it might be. They would hire me as a hired gun, bring me in to fix this stuff, and they wouldn't sugarcoat anything. They would tell me this person is terrible at doing this. This part doesn't work. We need to tweak this. But because it's funny because like in today's world, I've got traditionally published books, and if an editor calls you, they sandwich everything. They give you 2 or 3 things they love about the book, then they tell you the one thing they actually need you to fix, and then they tell you a couple more things they love about the book before they hang up that phone call. But when you're a hired gun, like they don't sugarcoat anything. And I think after all those years of having that direct feedback from editors, from people that were actually putting out these books, that taught me what the folks in New York were really looking for in a mass market best-selling novel. And I hear their voices when I write a sentence, like that's not going to work, take it out. And it's kind of followed me ever since. But I think that's where a lot of it comes from.
Yeah, and I was listening to one of your podcasts with the Art of Autism, and in it you mentioned what I think is a fairly interesting approach, where you approach by writing a blurb first, or the like the bit of the text on the back of usually the back of the book. So I was kind of curious, how does that help you to then continue on in writing the story, or is that still something that you do?
Yeah, no, it's still something I do. I basically I come up with the title, I come up with the tagline, and then I write the 200 words that would appear on the back of the paperback, and I keep that in front of me the entire time I'm writing the novel. So every day when I sit down to work, I review that, and it helps keep me on task. When I first started in this world publishing on my own, I was what they call a pantser, which I'm sure your audience has heard that term before. I came up with my characters, my plot. I kind of dropped them all together and mixed it up, and the characters kind of told me what happened, and I wrote it down as quickly as I could. That worked for me for the longest time, and then I started writing books with James Patterson. And he basically taught me the how to outline a book, and I've realized over time that that's way more efficient.
You also wrote a Rolling Stones article on that concept of talking about the plotter versus pantsers, and the benefit of solving problems ahead of time, which in turn leads to less writer's block. Something I thought that was really cool was I've recognized that in myself in my own writing, and reading that I was like, you know what, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. But yeah, whenever I write a story and I outline it first, I find it's a lot easier to progress through. So the question I had for you though is, as you're doing your outlining, how deep do you go into outlining? Do you start at like just arcs or chapters, or do you go like all the way down to like granular moments?
I've learned from James Patterson, and he kind of knows what he's doing. So I follow the same model that he's been doing for years. So we probably come up with, if I had to guess, 30,000 words on an outline before we actually start writing the book. Probably about 200 words per chapter. Just a couple quick things. It could be a couple sentences, a couple pieces of dialogue, but just something to tell us what that chapter is going to be about, and just to ensure that the story is actually moving forward. There's no filler in there. What I like about the outlining process versus the whole pantsing thing, I live on an island. I go for a run every day after I finish up work, and I do a lap around the island. And when I was pantsing a novel, I would use that time to figure out what comes next in the story, because you don't really know, right? You might have a little bit of a vision, but it's almost like trying to see something through heavy fog. You can see a little bit, but not too far. But I would always stay ahead of it. I would when I go out for that run, I would think about what comes next. So the next day, I had that piece, and then the next day I'd run again, come up with the next piece. I always stayed ahead of it. But what I've learned since I have an outline in front of me is I can use that same brain power to figure out what comes next better, because I already know what comes next. So now I can tweak the story. And it comes out much tighter, much more intricately plotted, and a lot less words on the cutting room floor. And I've got to credit Patterson for that, because when we first met, we talked about writing styles. He told me he was an outliner. We talked about the way I wrote books, and we didn't think it was going to work. So we took a step back, and a couple months went by, and he called me up and said, "You know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel." So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to pants a novel. So I would write a chapter, I would paint him into some kind of crazy scenario. He'd write a chapter, 10 minutes later, send it back to me. Not only did he get out of what I just put him into, but he put me into something even worse. It was a twisty book, because we just kept doing that to each other, just having fun with it. But a lot of words ended up on the cutting room floor, because you get to that last page and you've got to go back and tweak everything. You've got to fix all these problems. I think we wrote about 160,000 words on that book, and we probably took about 40,000 out before it went off to the editor. So we finished that up, and to his credit, he said, "Okay, we tried it your way. I want you to try it my way." And he sent me an outline for a book called The Noise. And I saw how much more efficient that process was. Just writing that book, it was so seamless from start to finish. I haven't looked back, so I've been outlining ever since. But I think everybody needs to try, different methods. Sooner or later you will find the one that works for you. I've got a podcast called Writers Inc., where we've interviewed literally every big name author out there. Some of them 2 or 3 times. We always get their origin story, and none of them are the same, and none of them have the same writing process, and none of them have used the same writing process from start to finish. They constantly change it up, and I try to do that too. I think it helps keep it fun. It keeps it interesting as you go. Especially when you're writing a lot.
On the note of outlining, you also mentioned in one of your interviews that for The Noise specifically, you got optioned while you're in the middle of writing it. How did that affect your outcome of writing it? Because from what I understand, editors and screenwriters and directors and producers, that is a very different approach to how you're evaluating a story, especially while you're in the middle of writing it.
Yeah, so I mean, I've worked with a lot of other people, working as a book doctor and ghostwriter. Almost my entire writing career had been working with others. So actually writing a book all by myself kind of feels weird to me. But with that one, Patterson's got a pretty strong film and TV, team working for him. They saw the potential in it, I think at the outline stage. So he knew even at that point before we started writing the book that this was probably going to go to television. So they started shopping it for that. They ended up landing a deal with E1. They brought in, I believe it was a producer for a show called The 100. And a few other people. But yeah, they started reviewing the pages as we went. So we would write a couple of chapters. I'd send them off to Jim, or Jim would send them to me. We'd go back and forth. And when we were fine with them, they would go off to the producers and the writers on that particular project. And they would weigh in on, very different topics. I mean, they'd weigh in on the story itself, but also, things like shooting locations. Like, you can't do this, it's going to be too expensive. How about if we do this? And they were tweaking things along those lines, which is not something I had actually thought of before. And I've had a lot of stuff optioned. I've had every book that I've written has been optioned with the exception of one. So I've been dealing with those people for a very long time, but never in the moment. It's always after the fact. Like I wrote a book at one point called A Caller's Game, and everything had been optioned prior to that. So I purposely wrote a book that I didn't think they could film, because I blow up like half of New York in this. The book immediately got optioned. Like Ridley Scott's company picked it up right after we published. And it turns out all it does is just change the price tag. I was told, yes, we can blow up half of New York, but it's going to cost us $200 billion to do it. And so there is nothing that can't be filmed. But I've had so many of those conversations now. When I do write a scene, I think about those kind of things. Like, does this location make sense? Do we need to change it up? Are there too many characters? What are the film guys going to do to it when they get it? And I don't know that those voices should be in your head as a writer. It'd probably be better to tune them out. But for me, it's hard to do that.
Yeah, and you've talked about how you've tended towards more of like the novel writing, but with the work that you've been doing, in a way, you're kind of doing a form of screenwriting. Have you ever done like formal screenwriting for like a play or a movie or a TV show?
Yeah, so I did on that same book, A Caller's Game. Ridley Scott's company had it, and then at one point they reached out and asked if I wanted to write the screenplay for it. So I sat down and I did that for the first time just to see if I would like it. My movie ended up being 4.5 hours long. And I think the reason for that is, like when I write a book, I write the whole story, then I go back through and I trim out anything that I think doesn't need to be there. It's almost like a good piece of steak. You just trim the fat away before you throw it on the grill. So in my mind, the book is about as lean as you can get. There's nothing that can come out. So I'm too close to the project. So when I wrote the screenplay for it, I didn't take anything out. I literally just took the book and dumped it into a screenplay format and just tweaked what I needed to and handed it off. And again, like I didn't think that was going to work. And this was a couple of years ago. They obviously pushed back because nobody's going to film a 4.5 hour movie. But the film and TV guys have circled back to it because in today's world, streaming is so popular. They have no problem doing 2 or 3 episodes or 8 episodes or whatever they need to get something on film. So those time constraints don't really exist anymore. So even something like that didn't work a couple of years ago, all of a sudden works today.
Yeah, that's totally fair. One of the things I would be curious to hear about, you mentioned, coming out of finance, and in one of your podcasts, you mentioned that you worked upwards of like 60 to 80 hours a week. But on top of that, you're still able to find time to write. So either writing for yourself or writing as a book doctor. So one of the questions I had for you is, what strategies have you found that have been helpful to carve out time to make progress in the middle of that busy schedule?
Yeah, so writing to me has always been, like my happy place. So if I get stressed out, if I lock myself in a room and I work on a story or something, it helps to center me. So when I, was working in finance, chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, that's a highly stressful position. A lot of people, flunk out after a couple of years. So I needed a way to balance that scale. So I had to find a way to write. But working that many hours, you have to figure out how to squeeze it in. And like I would write sometimes in line at the grocery store, sometimes at, at traffic, at a red light. It didn't matter. I'd break my phone out and I would start working. Some of the things that I learned, though, to help get me into the right headspace is anytime I write, I listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack, essentially white noise. I've got an app on my phone. I've got one on my computer. Anytime I want to write, I just play that sound, and it's like a Pavlov's dog thing. I mean, as soon as my brain hears that noise, it knows it's time to write. So I'm able to snap right into that mode. One of the other things that I learned early on, if you write a couple hundred words a day, that's a novel in a year, so that's a good goal. And anybody, I think, can write 200 or 300 words a day. But I've noticed that if I need to set certain constraints on myself. Like I found my personal sweet spot working full time is 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. I can write more than that. I can sit down and have some kind of marathon session and get 6,000 or 8,000 words. But a lot of that's going to be garbage. And it's almost like squeezing water out of a rock. When you get to the end of it, like you're exhausted. And I've noticed that when I did do that, I would sit down the next day and I would stare at that blank screen for an hour or two trying to figure out what comes next, because I literally just put it all on paper the day before. So what I do in today's world is I stop mid-sentence, and I did this even back in the corporate days. Once I hit my word count, I would just stop. Even if, I was 2 words into a particular sentence. And this way my brain always knew what was coming next, whether it just, was the rest of that sentence or the rest of that paragraph. But I find that it was much simpler for me to just get back into that headspace because, you sit down and you immediately hit the ground running. I've gotten to know Dean Koontz over the years, and one of the strategies that he taught me, which works fantastic, is I start every day by reading whatever I wrote the previous day. And I go through and I clean it up and I edit it. And by the time I get to the end of that, again, I'm back into the story. My mind is in the right spot, and it's that much easier to continue. I find it difficult to actually not write every day. Not only am I driven to do it, but like if you don't do it, you lose track of where you are in the story. I talk to a lot of people who tell me they're writers, but when I ask them when they actually write, it's like, well, like every other Saturday, or 3 hours on the third week of the moon is full. Like they've got this weird, like it doesn't happen on a regular, consistent basis. Yeah. And when they do finally sit down, they have to try to remember where they were in the story. So like there's work that has to be done there. And it can take a long time to get to the finish line. And when that happens, your voice is actually different from start to finish, so that creates additional work. I find that if you write every day, it's almost like going to the gym every day. It's like writing is like an exercise, like a writer muscle. You exercise it every single day, it gets stronger. Your word count can increase, and it just gets that much easier. But if you take a couple days off, the exact opposite happens. So if you write every day, I find that it's much easier to get to the finish line.
Yeah, totally. And I liked how you have it written in your Goodreads bio. You say that you have characters that are impatiently tapping their feet, waiting for their turn to be heard, which I can definitely resonate with. The question I have for you, though, is how do you keep track of all your characters? You've written quite a lot and over quite a number of years. How do you keep track of your characters, and how do you make them distinct to each other?
I mean, for the most part, once I'm done with the book, the characters are kind of done. All of my stories are almost like a snippet of their life. It's almost like you take a camera and you just all of a sudden put it on somebody, and their life is happening midstream, and then the story finishes and you pull that camera away. But they're living a life before that, they're living a life after that, and that's kind of how I picture them in my head. They're not just there for the story. We're just seeing a glimpse of a portion of their life on those pages. As far as creating characters, I don't know where a lot of this stuff comes from. It's like asking where the ideas come from. They are very real to me, though. I mean, before I write the first word of a book, I make sure I know that person inside and out. To give you an example, in my 4MK series, my lead detective is a guy named Sam Porter. I can take Sam and drop him at the entrance to Disney World, and I can tell you what ride he's going to go on first. I can tell you where he's going to eat lunch. I can tell you what he's going to eat. I know his favorite song. I know the name of his first girlfriend. None of these things will ever make it into a book, but I know him as well as I know my best friend, and that allows me to write him as a character and keep it realistic. I think if you're doing it properly, you should be, if you put 3 of your characters in front of you, you ask them all the exact same question, you should get 3 different answers, just like you would if you were to ask 3 real people that same question. If you're not, then you basically have a paper character, and you have to do a little bit more development. One of the things that I learned early on, though, just to save a little time, is I used to base characters on actors and actresses. So if I needed to, a quick and dirty way to get somebody down on paper, I would say, okay, this person is like Ben Affleck. This person is like, Carrie Underwood. And that immediately gives you, expressions. It gives you mannerisms. It gives you vocal patterns. Something that you can build on. And if you start a book that way, a lot of times by the time you get to the end of it, that character is fully formed, and they're very different from what you first started with. And then you just have to take another pass over the novel to kind of tie everything up. And a lot of times that's just dialogue and stuff like that has to be tightened, because they tend to come to life a little further on in the book. But it's an easy way to start the process.
I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about some of your other stories where there's existing, let's say, IP or stories. So, for example, you've had the opportunity to write with Dacre Stoker, with the co-write of Dracul. And for people who didn't know, this is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker. So when we're talking about icons, this is one of the big ones. So how do you approach writing a story that continues something as iconic as Bram Stoker's Dracula? And can you talk a little bit about that process?
That was a tough one for me. Obviously, when somebody asks you to write a prequel to Dracula and it's Bram Stoker's family that's asking you to do it, the answer is always yes. You find a way to make it happen. But it was intimidating because Dracula is actually one of my all-time favorite books, and it always has been. When I was a kid, I mentioned I used to read a lot. I picked up a copy of Dracula when I was 8 years old at a yard sale. It was 25 cents, and it was sitting in a box with other books. And I didn't think my mom was going to let me buy it because the cover looked very scary, and it was basically what I considered to be the very first adult book that I had ever read. And it's the first book that actually scared the bejesus out of me. Like I finished it and like I left the lights on in my room for like weeks at a time after finishing up that book. And I think because it got an emotional reaction out of me, I've been chasing that feeling as a reader and a writer ever since. But that book means a lot to me, and it means a lot to a lot of other people. It's the second most purchased book in the world next to the Bible. It's extremely popular. People have doctorate degrees in Dracula, so like I knew it was something we had to get right from the get-go. But when I sat down with Dacre and he started telling me the story behind this, there was no way I could walk away from it. So apparently Bram really believed vampires were real, to the point that when he died, he had himself cremated at a time in history when people just didn't do that. He in the original Dracula, we assume that Dracula begins with Jonathan Harker on the train. That's the book that we all know if you've read Dracula. That's actually page 103 of the original manuscript. Bram wrote another 100 pages prior to that portion that were very autobiographical and basically explained why vampires were real. And when he brought the manuscript in and turned it into his editor read it and pushed it right back across the desk and said, "There's no way we can publish this. It's too scary." Because at the time, Jack the Ripper was active in London, so people were already on edge, and they believed in the paranormal. They believed in the supernatural. So when you present it the way that Bram presented it, they weren't willing to do it. So they made him strip those first 102 pages out of the story. So Dacre told me, like, this is the story we're going to tell. We're going to recreate what Bram wanted to tell in that original story. But we had to piece it back together because nobody has those 100-some pages. We went through Bram's journals, notes, and diaries, and things that he left behind. Anything that he had, like on his desk when he wrote the original Dracula. The Stoker family has a lot of that. So we pieced everything together that we possibly could. Thought we recreated the story to the best of our ability, and then we wanted to verify it before we took it out, anywhere, where be seen by the public. So we tried to track down the original manuscript, and it turns out the only one that's ever been found was located in a barn in Pennsylvania. Nobody knows how it got there. A general thinking in the Stoker family is Bram traded it with another manuscript with Walt Whitman, and they somehow crossed. But this family just found it in a trunk in their barn. It was purchased at auction by Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. So I reached out to Paul Allen's people and asked, is there any way we could see this manuscript, hoping that those first 100-some pages were there. He agreed, and we flew out to Seattle. They locked us in a conference room, took away our phones, made us wear gloves, and these big, scary-looking guys kind of stood over us as we flipped through this thing. We immediately opened the first cover, hoping to see page 1, and we actually saw page 103, and it was crossed out with a 1 next to it in Bram's handwriting. So that, even that manuscript didn't have those 100 pages. But as we flipped through, we started to focus on the deleted scenes because it was a typed manuscript. So when Bram wanted to delete something, he just drew a line through it. So when we started to focus on the stuff that he deleted, those deleted sections referenced the first 100 pages. So we were able to confirm our story through that. which was a fun thing to do. Being autistic, I've got this weird ability. Like autistic people in general, we mimic others. So if we're in a social situation where in a group of people, somebody cracks a joke, I'm going to start laughing because the people around me are laughing. So I'm going to be a millisecond behind them. But I'm always kind of imitating what's perceived as quote unquote normal. And I've learned over the years that I can also do that on paper. I can mimic other authors. So if you put text in front of me written by somebody, I can read that and pick up on their vocabulary, their writing style, their voice, their cadence, and I can continue that story in their voice, which is essentially what I did with Dracul.
Yeah, and I guess continuing that thought, you've talked about how you've taken something that is an existing writing and then adding to it as a prequel. You also had the opportunity to work on another iconic story, Flatliners. I think the working title at the time of an article I was reading calls it Flatliners Resurrection, which Global Newswire is predicting potentially one of the largest bidding wars of the year in the publishing industry, which is significant. But the thing that I wanted to talk about was what was slightly different is, in this case, looking to be more of a reboot than a continuation. So how do you take something that's, something similarly iconic, well-known by in subculture, how do you take something like that, but then make something that's fresh while still honoring that source material? And can you talk a little bit about it if there's any news on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two different approaches to something like this. When I look at it from a business standpoint, I've always got something in the fires that I know is going to draw a lot of press. So writing a prequel to Dracula, that drew a lot of attention. I made a lot of noise. So as an author, that gets my name out there in front of a lot of people, helps me expand my audience. So I always look for projects that I know are going to do that. With Flatliners, Peter Filardi is the guy who originally wrote it. He was on Dracul as one of the screenwriters at one point, and we started talking about it. And Flatliners has always been one of my favorite movies, just as a fan. Anybody who remembers it, it had this crazy cast. It had Kiefer Sutherland, Billy Baldwin, Oliver Platt, Kevin Bacon, Julia Roberts, basically all at the start of their career before they were, became the household names that they are today. And the movie still holds up if you watch it. It's about a bunch of medical students that kill each other one at a time and then bring each other back to life just to try and determine if there's any kind of afterlife. So it's like this really cool story. But they tried to reboot it in 2016. They did a remake of it, and they basically rehashed the original story with a new cast and just kind of modernized it a little bit. That didn't work. It fell flat because it's not what people are looking for. So I knew that we had to do something unique with the story and take it in a very different direction, which is essentially what we did. And I wish I could tell you what that was, but with them shopping the book right now, I don't want the plot to sneak out there.
Yeah.
But as they're reading it, they're like, "Oh, this is very different. This is not something that we expected." And that's what you want to do. It's almost like when you're writing, like if your character hops in a car and, they turn the key and the car starts, it's not as much fun as if the car doesn't start. So like as an author, I always look for those particular moments. What can I do that's going to surprise people? What kind of twist can I throw in here? And business is no different than that. When you write a screenplay, when you write a book that you want to sell to other people, you need to surprise them. They need to read it and go, "Holy crap, I need to make this." And I believe that's where we're at with Flatliners. I mean, we're getting a lot of attention there, so we'll see what happens with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to hear more. Definitely, definitely some core memories growing up with that one. I guess turning to your one of your more recent books, Something I Leave Upstairs. Kind of continuing on your point there, I just finished reading it, and wow, that was quite the wild ride. It was trippy, it had a mysterious plot. I got caught up in the book multiple times where I was just like flipping page after page. One of the things, though, that I thought was also really cool was you had like these subtle hints, like little teases, just to kind of keep the reader guessing and to keep you on the edge of like what's going to happen on the next page. And so I was curious to hear about how do you approach deciding how much to reveal, how much to hide, and at what point do you give information to kind of keep your reader going?
That's tricky because I've never had any formal training as a writer, but I've read so much that like the story structure is just kind of ingrained in my head. So when I'm writing, like I know when a particular twist should happen. Like it feels like it just needs to go right here. And if I don't put it right there, it's almost like I missed a turn on the highway. Like I know I went too far in the wrong direction and I've got to turn around and go back. Like it just feels like it's off. So I sort of know where to drop those things in there. One of the things that Patterson taught me that I do quite a bit is, I'll go back on my second draft of the book, and I'll take out like the last line of a particular chapter or the last paragraph of that chapter, because and that kind of creates a little mini cliffhanger. And subconsciously, like what we do as we're writing, like when we write a chapter as an author, we create closure, like whether we want to or not. The idea of a chapter is, there's a beginning, middle, and an end. So our brain wants to put that all down on paper. But if you're writing a thriller, you don't really want to give people the end. You want them to have to flip that page to figure out what comes next. So a lot of times I put the whole thing down on paper, but if you strip out that last little bit, you create that mini cliffhanger. It forces them to have to turn that page. And a lot of times it's as simple as just copy and pasting what you're taking out in chapter 2 and putting it onto chapter 3. But little tricks like that to get it done. When it comes to just seeding thoughts, a lot of times, I'll get an idea maybe 2/3 of the way through the book that just sort of makes sense. The nice thing about being the writer is you can go back and you can plug something in on page 20, something else on page 140, that kind of seeds that and, add a little bit of foreshadowing. So you can, if you need a gun on page 300, you can add it on page 23 to make sure that it makes sense. I always encourage authors to do that. Like don't shy away from something just because it didn't happen. You're literally playing God. You can do whatever you want in that story.
Yeah, very true, very true. And you've mentioned around the thriller aspect of your writing. But what I thought was interesting with this book is that you call it a chiller, quote unquote. Can you talk a little bit about how that term came about and how you differentiate a chiller from a thriller?
I wish I could take credit for that term, but I actually stole it from Peter Straub. I think they used that when they were marketing Ghost Story, if I remember correctly, but I remember it came from him. I'm known primarily for thrillers. So for this, this is not necessarily a horror story. It's basically a thriller with horror elements to it. And that's the point that I wanted to get across by using a term like that. The story itself, it's about, it's a kid, he's 17 years old, his grandmother dies and she leaves him a house. And it's a pretty unique house. It's on a private island off the coast. But imagine you're 17 years old and somebody gives you a house. Like, what are you going to do with it? He does exactly what you would expect and turns it into a party house for him and his friends. But even that gets old after a little while. And at one point, somebody raises their hand and says, "Hey, what would it take to make this a haunted house?" So they start exactly where you would expect. There's a Ouija board, there's a couple of scary stories, but the tagline for the book, which is right on the cover, is "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So you know where they're going. So even the title and the tagline, all these things are foreshadowing, where the story itself is going to go. I mean, the title of the book, "Something I Keep Upstairs," it's actually alluding to something that is being kept upstairs, which you find towards the end of the book. All of it kind of plays together.
Yeah, and I like too. You've talked about how you've kind of navigated through multiple genres and subgenres. Can you talk a little bit about how you found that to work well? I think it was Dean Koontz as well that helped give you a context of when approaching genres that you're able to weave it in such a way to keep your audience along, but while still giving you kind of a fresh angle to come at it from a writer's perspective. Is like you say, you've been writing for multiple decades.
Yeah, so when you're first published, even when you start shopping a book, they immediately want to put you in a box. So you send your book off to an agent, and they're going to say, "Okay, you are a thriller author, you're a horror author, you're a romance author." They need to label you so that they can turn around and tell the editor who you are, and that editor needs to tell the marketing people, and the marketing people have to tell the bookstore owners where to put you in the store. So those labels are very important from their perspective. From my perspective as an author, I've had friends that have, books that hit like really well, and all of a sudden, their editor wants that same book but different over and over and over again. And before you know it, you're 20 years in and you've been writing that same book, and like that gets old. That scared me. I didn't want that to be my career. So yeah, I talked to Koontz about it, and he pointed me to his Wikipedia page, and he helped me shape the text that I have in mind. And I forget the exact wording, but it says something like, "I'm I'm a suspense author and I may include elements of horror, sci-fi, this or that. So I'm essentially defining, the fact that I'm a suspense author, but, I can branch off into these other areas. From a publishing standpoint, I made a conscious effort from the get-go to bounce around, which everybody hated. My agents hated it, editors hated it. My first novel was horror. The second one was a thriller. Then I wrote a prequel to Dracula, so we're back into the horror world. Then I wrote another thriller, and I just continually bounced back and forth, which made their job very difficult. But what I'm finding is that, it's almost like being a literary Pied Piper. Like you can use genre to expand your audience. So at one point I was told that my primary audience was women 45 and over. So I wrote a young adult book, and all of a sudden my overall audience skewed younger. So you can branch off and you can expand that way, which is something that I've learned, not only from those guys, but working with Patterson. And if you look at what he's done recently, like he wanted to do the same thing. So, at one point he wrote a book with Bill Clinton. All of a sudden he expanded his audience to all these people that I've never heard of, about him before, never read him before. Then he did it again. He wrote a book with Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton is one of the biggest country stars in the world. She brought this huge audience to him that had never read him before. And just recently he announced he's writing a book with Mr. Beast, who's the #1 YouTube star. Again, that's going to, when that book comes out, he's going to rope in a lot of younger readers that, may not read at all, because their primary input is YouTube. So as an author, I think you need to think about all that. But again, like everybody pushes back when you do it, so you have to be ready for that fight. Your agent's going to hate the fact that you're doing it. Your editors are going to push back. But now I can show them with the numbers, that it actually works. And like we're seeing it even now with my foreign publishers, like in Spain, for example, I sell a ton of thrillers, but they've always shied away from my horror novels. But, it got to the point where they said, let's try publishing one of the horror novels and just see what happens. They did that, and then they bought all the other ones, and now they're putting those out too. So like it works on a worldwide basis. As long as you keep that common thread, something that the readers can identify with, so your voice is consistent throughout the books, you can branch out a little bit. You don't have to write that same book over and over.
That's awesome. I guess from the flip side, are there things that you've learned that don't work well as a common thread, or things that, if like, say, for example, there's an author who's trying to write to, let's say, a specific overall arching genre, but then they're playing around with the subgenres. What advice would you give to them as they try to play around with that? Like what things to avoid?
Well, I think you have to kind of base it on real life. I read a lot of romance books, mainly because I think you can easily take a romance subplot and you can put it into a thriller, you can put it into a horror novel, you can put it into a western. It's one of those things that fits in just about everything. So it's worth reading it to be able to do it right. If you just read the genre that you're writing, like if you write like Tom Clancy, so you read nothing but Tom Clancy, you kind of have a very small little box that you're working within. So I think you have to expand beyond that. I think that's important. Everything has to be adjacent, so like, I mentioned my common thread is suspense, so you can have suspense in pretty much every other genre. So because of that, I can branch out. I don't think I could put a dragon in a book. I just finished reading Fourth Wing, which is a fantastic novel, but like I can't write that. I think what I've learned over the years is because thriller is my primary genre, people expect everything to be realistic. So I can include vampires, I can include this, and I can include that, but how I get to them needs to seem like something that could happen in real life. And if you dissect other people's works, take Pet Sematary, for example, at its core, that's a zombie novel. It's a horror novel. But the way that it's laid out, it feels very realistic. It feels like something that could play out and could happen to somebody. And I think that's key. If you jump directly into this, the supernatural, the paranormal, or a dragon flies out of left field, you have to explain it properly. And even a dragon. I mean, to be honest with you, there's a movie called Reign of Fire with Matthew McConaughey, which seems very plausible. They're digging a tunnel in London. All of a sudden, they hit some kind of pocket, and a dragon comes flying out. All of a sudden, dragons are here. So there are ways to take it and make it seem real. But I think that's key. Unless if you're writing strictly fantasy, you're creating your own worlds, that's what you're known for. You're going to be kind of stuck with that. Like you couldn't just write a police procedural then either. For the same reasons, you'd have to stick in that world that you're known for.
That's totally fair. Yeah, and I one comment on that is back to your book for a second. Is that I found that the dialogue was very realistic. It felt very natural. So the question that I had for you is, how do you make sure that your dialogue feels natural? Like, what tips do you have for writers who are trying to write compelling characters?
For me, it's a kind of a unique situation because being autistic, my memory works very weird. So I can pull back to remember things from when I was like 5 years old, 6 years old, teenage years, all those things, and it feels very fresh to me. So I can pull from that. So that helps. But one of the exercises I used to tell people to do when I was mentoring authors is to like go into a coffee shop and just eavesdrop on the people sitting next to you and literally type up that conversation. Not only listen to it, but see what it looks like on paper. Hopefully you got two or three people sitting there and they're not going to notice that you're actually doing this. But you're going to find that, you've got two or three unique voices. They each have their own speaking patterns, human voice, the way we talk, we break sentences up. We don't tend to speak in complete sentences. I think all of those things add to something realistic. If you do it properly, you should be able to take the dialogue out of your book, take everything else away and look at nothing but the dialogue. And you should know, just by reading each sentence, who said it. You should be able to tell. If you can't tell, then I think you need to go back to the drawing board. You have to keep working on it. Thomas Harris is fantastic at it. If you read like Silence of the Lambs or Red Dragon, you know exactly what sentence was spoken by who. And that's no accident. That's, it's no different than, if you are sitting in a room with five different people and you're listening to everybody speak, everybody is going to have a different vocal pattern. You need to be able to identify that. If you're not willing to go to a coffee shop and do that, you can do it with a TV show too. Throw Netflix on and just try it. But I think it's important to hear the words being said and see what they look like on paper.
Yeah, I definitely can appreciate that. It's interesting that when you put the words on paper, and even like inversely, when you read the words from the paper, how much of a different experience it can be, and like all the things that you can identify. One of the topics that you mentioned there was around your mentoring. Now you've mentioned in other podcasts how you look for co-authors that help take a new angle, a new spin on your work. But I'm curious about the other side of where you've worked with other authors who may not be as far along with you or as you. What do you look for in people who you're looking to co-author from more of a mentoring perspective?
I look for something I call the storyteller gene. I think you can teach the math, or like the actual grammatical rules to just about anybody, like punctuation, grammar, all that kind of stuff. I think anybody can learn that, but only certain people are capable of telling a story. If you're sitting around a campfire and one person starts telling a story and everybody's captivated, that guy's got it. The person next to him might try to tell a story and they lose everybody immediately. They don't. Like you can see that on paper. Some people are just capable of telling a story and in other words aren't. So I look for that person that has that storyteller gene, but is missing something else. They're not quite able to communicate what they're trying to get out there on paper. Or I see them making some of the mistakes that I saw, early on with other writers. Maybe they're doing a lot of passive voice, like it could be anything, a lot of showing versus telling, something that could be corrected. But as long as they've got the storyteller gene, you've got something you can build on.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I guess something else that you've done is you've written a lot about different aspects of writing and publishing in the industry. You've got experience in self-publishing, traditional publishing, hybrid publishing. One of the Rolling Stone articles you mentioned around, I think it was the rapid release kind of publishing that you're seeing today. So what are you seeing from the industry as it relates to rapid release, and how can authors position themselves in it?
Well, I think we're seeing it on the traditional side. They're starting to rapid release, and I think a lot of these things come from the indie world. They see something working well on the indie side, and they adopt it, and they tend to try and do it. Usually a couple years after the fact. Indie and traditional is a very odd thing. I always like it to I think of it as boats in a harbor. Like a traditional publisher is like a giant cruise ship, and an indie author is like a little speedboat. So if they want to turn that cruise ship, they can do it, but it's going to take a long time. An indie author can just zip around and do this and do that. So as an indie, if you get an idea, you can implement it within a couple hours and you can run. Traditional side, it could take a couple of months for that same thing. So rapid release, I think it's one of those things that worked very well for indies for a very long time. I think most indies have actually moved away from it because it's not working quite as well as it used to. But the traditional world has started to adopt it. And that's happening, across the board. I mean, like if you think back to BookBub, if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, it was strictly indie authors in BookBub. And if you look at it today, it's all traditional published authors. They've taken that over. Pricing structures, I think, are going to happen next. A lot of indie authors tend to price really low. They price it like $3 for an ebook. Traditional publishers are still at 13, 14, $10, or they're higher up there. I think that's going to be the next thing to go. I think they're going to start pricing lower too, and unfortunately, that's going to cause the entire market to come down, which means indie authors are going to have to do something different again. I tend to look at what indie authors are doing. If I can incorporate it into my own stuff, I'll do it. The traditional publishers are definitely looking at the indie world, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm curious from your perspective. You've seen kind of the shift of the industry over the last few decades. What would you say for people who are just starting out, as far as recommending between the different avenues of self-publishing, traditional publishing, hybrid, for like a new or debut author in today's world?
I still tell people to take the traditional route. I think it's important that they, write the book, they get out there and they query agents, mainly because agents, they're gatekeepers. And, like if you take a book that you've written, you send it out and you get a bunch of rejections, the worst thing I think you could do is just turn around and say, okay, well, I'm going to indie publish it. I'm just going to put it out on my own. I think what you really need to do is you need to go back to those agents, try to figure out why they rejected it. Hopefully some of them will tell you. There's going to be a reason, and that's something that actually needs to be fixed in the book before you put it out. Because if you don't, if you just self-publish it, you put that book out there, your friends and family are going to read it, they're going to review it, you're going to get 10 or 25-star reviews, and then all of a sudden the real readers are going to stumble into it, and they're going to start giving you those 1-star and 2-star reviews because it has problems that you've never actually worked out. And one of the things that's a huge benefit when you're in the traditional world is you've got a lot of people helping you make your book better. Your agents helping you, your editors helping you, co-authors are helping you. There's a lot going on there. As an indie author, if you're just doing it all on your own, you're just taking the book, you're writing it, you're publishing it, you're going to make the same mistakes over and over again because nobody's helping you correct them. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of indie authors, they kind of stall. They hit a certain plateau and they can't get any higher. There's nobody there helping them, improve their overall style. And I think we all need that.
You also have shown kind of let's say a path that a person could follow, being that you, I guess maybe yours is a bit of a unique scenario in that I believe your first book was technically a self-publish, but you kind of brought in a lot of your experience from ghostwriting. But then you got agented and then you had traditional publishing. But now it seems more that you're what someone would call maybe more of a hybrid approach, where you have traditional publishing, but then you do have self-publishing. How do you decide whether or not you're going to pursue, traditional publishing for a certain work that you have, or if you're deciding to self-publish it now that you've built up a name for yourself?
I think in general, those waters are getting really muddy. So I published the first one, Indie published it, but I sold a lot of copies, which put me on the radar of the traditional publishers. So I ended up getting a nice sized deal for my next book, and that put me in their world. And I did a couple of books with traditional publishers, a couple thrillers. We did the prequel to Dracula, all of those landing with the traditional guys. But because I had gotten a taste of being an indie author, there's a lot of freedom there. The economic benefits are very strong. As an indie, you make 70 cents on the dollar versus traditional. You're lucky if you get 15 or 20 cents on the dollar. They might give you a nice big check at the beginning, but you've got to pay that back, and you're paying it back in these small little increments. So at one point, I took a step back and said, do I really want to keep repeating that? Because, I know how to put out these books on my own. And once they pulled back the curtain, I realized the traditional publishers aren't really doing anything different. That they're not doing anything special that we can't do. So I called my agent. It was that same book I mentioned earlier, A Caller's Game. And I said, listen, I'm going to go ahead and publish it in English on my own through my own press. And you can publish, through all the foreign publishers that we typically use. And I'm in about 150 different countries. So she did that. And that's what I consider to be a hybrid approach because, part of, the book was published in indie, in some markets, other markets it was published traditionally, but we kind of mixed it up a little bit. But then I realized there is one piece that traditional publishers can provide that we can't do as an indie. They tend to get into some locations that we can't do. Indie authors have a very difficult time getting into airports, getting into bookstores in general. Getting into the big box stores is near impossible, like Target, Walmart, Costco, as an indie. So for me, that was another problem that I had to solve. And that was, I went through a couple of books trying to come up with a way to do it. Ultimately, I struck a deal with Simon & Schuster where they allowed me to create my own imprint, which is what I'm doing today. So I basically have my own publishing house, but my print sales and distribution is handled by Simon & Schuster. So I kind of have the best of both worlds. I can publish what I want when I want, like an indie author, but because I have Simon & Schuster behind me, I'm able to get into those other locations. And I honestly think that that's the next logical step for a lot of indie authors that are selling well, for that same reason. That's the only reason to really give up, a certain percentage of those royalties because they can open some doors for you.
From the Creative Pen podcast, I just want a direct quote because I thought this was really cool. You said, authors will pay it forward as much as we can. And I've definitely seen that in the things that you've been doing, like even joining this podcast is one. But you've done a number of things where it's like you've progressed to a certain point, but then you're turning around and saying, what can I do for other people? Which I think is pretty cool. But the question I have for you is, what ways have you found that are like the most helpful, either for yourself and people helping you, or for you to help others when it comes to paying forward?
In a lot of ways, it's just about having a dialogue. I've reached out to, one of the things I learned in the business world is if you want to learn something new, try to find whoever is best at it and reach out to that person and see if you can get advice from them. So I've chased down some of the biggest names in publishing, and luckily some of them have been nice enough to talk to me. But when I can get the ear of somebody like James Patterson, he's not only teaching me how to write, he's teaching me a ton on the business side. And he's totally willing to do it. And I think if you sit down with any big name author, if you go to a conference, you walk into Thriller Fest and you sit at a table with Lee Child, he will talk to you about all this stuff because it wasn't that long ago that he was a struggling author trying to get that first book published. Authors tend to remember that. And I think that's one of the reasons why they do pay it forward. We've all sat in that chair. We've all been on both sides of it. And it's rewarding, to be able to help somebody out. If you see somebody struggling with a problem that you've struggled with yourself, that the answer to, by all means, tell them what that answer is. There's no reason for them to spend 6 months floundering, when you can get them over that hurdle that much faster. Podcasts like this, I still to this day listen to a ton of writing podcasts, and I still learn new stuff every day. I don't think that ever ends. I think when it does end, it's probably the day you need to retire.
Indeed. Well, I thank you again for taking some time every day to talk to us. For those who are listening in, where's the best place to find out more about you or your books?
Easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social media at jdbarker. The books are pretty much in every bookstore.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Creating Writing Wizard Podcast, author interviews. I'll leave links to J.D. Barker's website and book in the description below, along with references that we talked about through our conversation. If you learned something from our conversation, feel free to let me know in the comments and subscribe for more content like this to help you in your writer's journey. But most importantly, keep writing and stay creative.